Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this special edition episode of the What's Up WID podcast. My name is Marcie Roth, and I am WID's Executive Director and CEO. I'm happy to serve as your host today as I chat with the wonderful Sheri Fink. Sheri is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Emmy-nominated television producer, and the author of the New York Times best-selling nonfiction book, 5 Days at Memorial, Life and Death in a Storm-Ravaged Hospital. This book is about choices made in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Sheri is a producer of the 5 Days at Memorial limited series on Apple TV Plus as well. Today, Sheri and I will be discussing a whole host of topics, but I'm first going to start with just a little bit of being a fangirl. So I've followed Sheri's writing from her ProPublica days, from all sorts of writing that she has done in her time with the New York Times, and then certainly with my own experiences with Hurricane Katrina and the work that I've done in the intersections of disability, rights, justice, and disaster. Sheri's very deep awareness of some of the issues that we grapple with really attracted me to her even more. And so I got real brave one time and reached out and thought, well, I'll never hear back from her. And I heard back in about 2 minutes. So we've had just, I think, delightful conversations back and forth for a long time now. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to ply Sheri with questions. So, and more importantly, listen to your answers. So let me introduce Sheri Fink, an amazing human and a fabulous, fabulous writer.
Oh, thank you, Marcie. And it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. It's wonderful to have been in conversation with you over these years, and also just to, the work that you do is you're always at the center of issues that, or every disaster that comes up, you're at the center of work and issues that are, very important and very often not front and center as one might expect that they would be, because they're so central to the issues of emergency response and preparedness and resilience. So I'm very glad to have learned from you over the years and delighted to be here today.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that's one of the things I'd love to talk about. But first, if you would just tell everybody, how did your journey bring you to where you're at right now?
Well, I have an unconventional background for a journalist, because I actually went to medical school and also did a PhD in basic science. So I have a medical background, and then I got very interested in some of the humanitarian crises that were happening around the time that I was a student, and a genocide going on in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia, and ended up connecting in the very early days of email back then with some peers, in a way, medical students in the Balkans who were essentially becoming war doctors, and realized that there was a lot to learn from them and their experiences, and ended up going off for what I thought was a year between med school and residency to work in the Balkans. And one thing led to another. Wars broke out. I ended up doing humanitarian aid work myself, and then getting very passionate about writing about some of these issues of medicine in crisis, medicine in extreme situations, which I could see in some way was a kind of a magnification of a lot of the issues that are with everyday medicine that affect medical providers and patients and the people who love those patients all the time, but are, magnified in a way in these crises. So we see them more, and maybe we have a chance to pay attention to them and do something about them. So I think that's kind of what led me to where I am today. That was the key turning point.
Those of us who sort of get that pull to do humanitarian work, it's I know some of our listeners are going to laugh because they know exactly how someone can sort of take a giant leap into humanitarian action, and then you're never the same again. So how did you come to be so focused on memorial and the circumstances for people in New Orleans during Katrina?
So after years of doing emergency response work overseas in these, what were at that time called complex humanitarian emergencies, they had aspects of natural disasters sometimes, but a lot of human actions were influencing, the toll of those emergencies. So after having responded to conflict situations and disaster situations in many different countries, Hurricane Katrina hit the U.S. in 2005. And I think I was really naive. I think a lot of people were in the U.S. in just assuming that, we'll do better. We are so blessed to have so many resources in terms of, monetary resources or, just materials and also the wonderful human beings who populate our health systems and emergency response systems. So yeah, just that assumption was there, and seeing the utter, failures of the infrastructure, the immense suffering and death toll that resulted, it was very striking and jarring and upsetting and, deeply, it just problematic. And so I actually volunteered after Katrina with a public health team that was working in shelters where people who were displaced from their homes, they were in these huge, often, stadiums all over Louisiana. And we were documenting the health needs at these shelters where lots of people were displaced from New Orleans after the levees failed and the city flooded. And this particular story of Memorial Hospital, which was one of many hospitals that were surrounded by floodwaters, where the people inside were waiting days and days for rescue. Power failed, backup power failed. The situation was on the news. It was one of many stories after Katrina that stood and represented larger problems with our response, our preparedness, our mitigation measures. And but what was so striking about this particular case was that very early on there were accusations that some health professionals had intentionally hastened the deaths of their patients. And I thought it really caught my notice, but it was a big story at the time. A lot of people forget. It was just a big news story because people who worked at that hospital immediately reported that they disagreed with what some of their colleagues had done. And I had just written a book about a Bosnian war hospital that was under siege for 3 years, no power, bombs going, raining down, having to do war surgery with no anesthesia. And I had spent years working on that book and interviewed the survivors from that town. And I'd never heard of this coming up. Like I'd heard of, like in fiction or in movies where you see, like difficult decisions, end of life in a crisis. But in this war zone for 3 years where they didn't have power, they didn't get desperate enough to have even talked about ending the lives of patients. So it felt like whatever had happened, and there were different accounts at that time, or just a lot of like people saying this couldn't have happened. Whatever had led people at that hospital to believe that something like this happened felt worth looking into. How had things gotten so desperate that this was even discussed, let alone, did it occur and why? And so I started looking into it. And then the people at the center of the accusations, for obvious reasons, were being told by their lawyers that they couldn't talk at that time. And so I really started to interview more and more people and realized that it wasn't just a story about the people who were being accused and said they were innocent, but a much larger story that involved the aspects that you referred to in the beginning, that intersected with issues of disability and bias and equity and many, many other important issues that are with us all the time in this country.
Right. And it's interesting to hear you pointing out that you were surprised by the failures here in the U.S. compared to your recent experiences and many experiences in disaster relief work in other parts of the world. And I know, to this day, 17 years later, people often refer to what happened during Hurricane Katrina as a, particularly significant milestone and perhaps a pivotal period. So do you see things have changed? How much are you watching? How much are you how much is humanitarian action still front and center for you, and what are you seeing?
So I've been deeply immersed in continuing to follow this topic of whatever words we want to put on it, but basically medicine in crisis or crises that affect healthcare, and of course that includes COVID. And I'm writing a book about COVID right now, and the common link here, and you mentioned that surprise that I had, it's in some ways very analogous to the fact that the U.S. was rated number one in preparedness, or the top level of preparedness for pandemics, by an international body that had been created shortly before this pandemic happened. And we, in terms of the deaths and the and so many levels and metrics, we've obviously done very poorly compared with many other countries. And I think it is that we have focused too much, and this, or maybe one of the issues here is that there's so much focus on our technological tools in this country, because we're blessed. Again, I keep using that word, blessed. We're lucky, we're fortunate to have, a lot of money in this country compared to other countries, and a lot of advanced technology in our health system. But in some ways, it can make us more vulnerable in a crisis. And so whereas this, town in Bosnia, which was this particular town that I wrote about, that was surrounded by, enemy forces and under siege for 3 years, but the people there had, they were a little more resourceful. Like they were able to recharge car batteries on the river that ran through town. And they did all sorts of hacks to kind of keep going at that time. And I'm not going to say it was easy or that people didn't become extremely desperate, but it kind of occurred to me that in some ways, in some aspects, we have we will be more vulnerable if we lose that sense of can do, or the ability to improvise, and and not just feel like if we don't have those tools that we rely on, that suddenly we can't do anything. And I think so that's the danger of relying, and this is not just in medicine, but just think of when you don't charge your cell phone and your smartphone and you suddenly don't have the map that helps you navigate a new place, or we're all getting very dependent on these things that run on power. So and then we haven't focused enough on maybe the human resources and the people, and investing in them, and ensuring that they have what they need to be able to do the job. And we saw this so much during COVID, where there were and remain huge pressures on the health workforce, and just a lot of our issues in the COVID response, particularly during the surges, had to put a huge amount of pressure on the health workforce. So that's I guess the negative side, or the side that we see, that there are still huge issues in our ability to be resilient in medicine and healthcare when there is anything from a hurricane to a pandemic and anything in between. I would say on the positive side, I do believe, and I'm curious if you agree with this because you've been in this game a long time, I think there's more awareness that preparedness and response are top priorities, and that there needs to be attention to them. And certainly there were some positive developments after Katrina, such as, and I'm sure you remember the years of battle that officials went through to pass this minimum standards of preparedness for healthcare providers in the U.S. in order to, as one of the conditions of participation in Medicare and Medicaid, which is obviously a big source of reimbursements for health providers. So now, after, I think it took a dozen years after Katrina, after a realization of all the many ways that health providers were vulnerable, there was, then a rule that required just some very minimal, having plans and doing an exercise and having some more robust backup power systems. But, we frequently, the focus goes to the next important thing. And this is it seems to be a human response to just move right on, not want to look back, and all of the outrage and all of the momentum for change and for investment a lot of times really goes away. And so I think the big question now, with regards to all that we've learned of our vulnerabilities with COVID, is what will change, and will anything change, and how much will change. So we see some areas of the country being, and again, I'd be interested, because you're at the center of a lot responses to coastal storms, et cetera, and very interested to look at Hurricane Ian in Florida, and some early suggestions that there may have been some improvements in the preparedness to weather that affected patients and healthcare institutions.
So much to unpack here. So let me begin by saying that I think that the resilience focus, the preparedness focus, has it's been a particular challenge because everybody still has this sort of medical model mindset that people with disabilities need to be planned for, rather than we are among the most resilient. We're master problem solvers. And so, to your fabulous example, we have to go to plan B and C and D all the time. So we're actually much better at planning for, what could go wrong, because stuff goes wrong all the time. And yet, our preparedness and our community resilience efforts continue to um, be unwelcomed or only marginally welcomed in our local communities. It's a um, it's a real head scratcher. And then, um, I love that you brought up the healthcare provider emergency preparedness rule, which was, as you said, many, many years in the making.
Because there
And
was so much
then,
pushback from industry, it should be said, about an
yes,
unfunded mandate. Yeah.
yes, yes, so much pushback.
And so much watered
And
down
then,
from the original
yeah,
plans. Yep.
yes, exactly. So much watering down. And then even after the rule was published and there was a year to launch it, um, then there was an effort to dismantle the rule. Um, and uh, and of course, to point out one of the disconnects, this particular rule, super important, but it the only consequences might be after the fact. If you are seeking Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement, um, and you have not met the requirements of the rule, you may not get reimbursed for the work that you've done. So um, that means taking funds away from healthcare providers after they've already done the work, which, as you can imagine, is not really a popular thing to do.
Mm.
Um, and yet they're not given the resources to do the planning. And as you said, focusing on exercises, focusing on communications, focusing on having the tools in place to deal with power outages and such. So there's the punishment will be, we won't pay you back, as opposed to, here, let's help you to make sure that all of these things are in place.
Mm.
Um, and so then, thinking about COVID, and I'm really interested to hear, you and I have talked a little bit about the horrors of the extreme impact of COVID on people with disabilities of all ages and people in congregate facilities who, just in nursing homes, and we're not counting group homes, we're not counting carceral facilities, we're not counting psychiatric hospitals, just, the sort of traditional nursing homes. It's estimated that about 200,000 people died from COVID. Most of them, according to the American Community Survey of nursing home residency statistics, 96, almost 97% of people in those long term care facilities are people with disabilities. So, um, in the disability community, as we call it, people who um, focus on disability rights and the you know the need for um, equity and justice to center the most disproportionately impacted, multiply marginalized people. it's commonly, um, we are well aware that everybody else has sort of talked about uh, the elderly, the people with comorbidities, underlying conditions, people who are fragile, people who are frail, all those, um, uh, you know, euphemisms for disability, which disability comes with some, civil rights obligations. And yet, as you talked about the horrific genocide that you experienced, many people in the disability community are calling the death of disabled people in COVID a genocide. So I'm really interested to sort of hear your reaction to some of the things that I just said, and then how can we um, get more focus on the sort of the medical perspective, the industry, I call it the humanitarian industrial complex, right? How can we sort of move all of that and move government to shift that paradigm so that the people most disproportionately experiencing the pain are the people who are the closest to the power? So I'll stop there. Now I've given you a bunch to unpack.
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. And that point you made at the beginning of your these comments about the adaptability, the resilience, the innovation, the creativity of people who live with disabilities, and that being an asset to planners who work on emergency response, like that should be seen as an asset, and that the individuals who have a lot of experience with adaptations, like, in other words, it's not just, oh, let's include them because that's the right thing to do, that people who are being planned for should be part of the planning, but it's also like, hey, it might actually help everybody even more. I mean, it's just such an important point that you made. And the other thing I want to reflect back on is just getting to what's changed and what hasn't. Absolutely, the disproportionate impact of these varying emergencies on people with disabilities, and a sense of, I would say, like, to me, as somebody observing and witnessing, bearing witness and trying to record, like, it, to me, there's a feeling that is sort of obvious. If the same groups of people are the ones dying disproportionately in these crises, like, what does that say about how society is valuing these groups of people? And I mean, it just feels it just feels outrageous to see it happen over and over and over again. It doesn't feel like, it feels like that has to be looked at and amplified, and maybe there is it's so ingrained, these biases are so ingrained that they're not even seen by people who are temporarily able.
Exactly. And I talked about the horrific loss of life in these congregate settings, and I mean, number one, it says a whole lot about, because we collectively presume that the people in nursing homes are old, and certainly you've told the story, and then the series has given us real visuals of the fact that people are considered expendable, disposable, left out, left back, left behind, and and at the same time, in your telling the story, I mean, you were mostly talking about people with disabilities, and when I talk about 96% of people in nursing homes being people with disabilities, well, you don't go to a nursing home because you're old. You go to a nursing home because you need support, and your community has failed to put that support in place. And so you have no choice. Um, you know, almost, I have never heard somebody say, boy, I can't wait until I can go to a nursing home, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So,
Right.
so, so I guess one of my real questions is, um, how how do we convince the storytellers to tell this part of that story?
Mm. Um, I mean, I I guess I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I feel like you're
Okay.
in activism, so I was a student activist around, certain issues, but then I became a journalist and I stepped back and thought actually as like journalism I felt like truth was its own form of activism, if that makes sense. Like if you tell stories like these are facts, right? It is a fact that these groups of individual like that people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted, and all of these metrics and some of the ones that you just cited, the horrific, just uh, unthinkable, but um, predictable in some way toll from the COVID pandemic, but you can see analogies in other recent disasters, and certainly Katrina, which we're talking about, with the deaths of so many people in nursing homes and in the hospitals, and even in the recent hurricane that hit not Florida but New Orleans again last year, a
Right.
year ago. It was
Right.
people in nursing homes, and people also just seniors who lived in just housing buildings that weren't prepared. So anyways, I'm going on and on about that. So I mean, I guess just telling those stories, getting the truth out is important, and I guess the activists need to um, to think about how to interest journalists or to get those stories out through your own, because now everybody has platforms with social. And
Mhm.
but I'm also concerned about, just so as a storyteller, as a journalist, what impact does this work have, and just sometimes telling the story and having people empathize with the individuals, it is powerful, but then what comes of it? And that's something I think about as a storyteller.
Mhm.
And maybe we should also tell the audience just a little more about, because they might not be familiar with the 5 days at Memorial story, but
Please.
just and where that intersects here, where that overlaps here, is that when the levees failed and the water started rising around this particular hospital in New Orleans, and the power was threatening to go out, there were actually two hospitals. There was a hospital, and then a hospital within a hospital, that had most of the people who couldn't ambulate, who were dependent on ventilators for breathing, people with multiple chronic health conditions, where they relied on a lot of care. And so it was called a long-term acute care facility. It was providing acute care, which hospitals do, but for a longer period, for people who needed long period of rehab, or had multiple intersecting medical issues. And so one thing that happened early on that was so telling in this hospital, as they decided who to prioritize for evacuation first, as the power was threatening to go out, the long-term acute care hospital patients were not even in the discussion because the main hospital controlled all the facilities. They controlled the helipad. And when they began to discuss which groups of patients should be prioritized, it's almost like they forgot about this hospital within a hospital that was most people. When you think about triaging a resource or who gets access, who should be prioritized, we've talked about in recent years, the COVID vaccines, when they first came out, like which groups should be prioritized. Often you should think about, well, who is it who needs that resource and who would, have a bad impact if they didn't have it. And so logically, it would be people who are power dependent, whose care relies on power. You would think you might want to prioritize them for rescue before the power fails. And they were completely left out of the discussion. And I remember interviewing, I spent many, many years. First, it was an article, then the book 5 Days at Memorial, and then, of course, the Apple TV Plus series that just premiered and can be watched now, that dramatized the story, that was that visualized it, so you can meet the individuals, see who are based on some of the real people there. But I remember early on, as I was interviewing people, they were telling me about that there were literally doctors who said, like, I can't remember, there's a quote in the book, the nonfiction book, like, we do too much for these folks, and there was an active tension within that hospital about, whether those individuals should be even entitled to the care that they were getting. And sure, of course, there is a valid discussion about, for-profit healthcare and sometimes, people not having the informed choice about how much care they want. And it can sometimes, people can make a choice to want or not want certain interventions. That is a valid conversation. But you see, and through the story, as the story unfolded, as these days of disaster unfolded, some of the biases or the sense that these individuals, lives were just, literally not a priority, not as much of a priority to save. And some of the doctors actually, we hear, I'm sure, a lot of people with disabilities have talked a lot about bias within healthcare. And so these were doctors, and they're quoted in the book literally saying things like this. And there's a moment, I remember interviewing some Coast Guard auxiliary people who were manning the phones when different calls were coming in for help. And the Coast Guard was organizing a rescue of the patients of this hospital within a hospital, which had reached out independently, trying to secure some rescue resources. And when the Coast Guard was about to send them and began to send the helicopters, the main hospital staff sent them away. And that was for a variety of reasons, but there was a statement again by a staff member of the hospital to the Coast Guard, something to the effect of, we don't think these folks will make it anyways, and it's not worth taking the risk. The helicopters were arriving at night. It was valid to be worried that it was dark and people could be injured. But that, it was stated so flatly that years later, when I found these officials, that they still remembered being shocked by that, and I think responding something like, shouldn't people who have the most vulnerabilities be prioritized first, not last? And that's really one of the questions that this situation raised.
And you all covered that so dramatically, visually, heartbreakingly in the 5th episode. The experience of people having to weigh these decisions. I, of course, come at this from a long-standing frustration that people with disabilities are, were considered a liability and not given an opportunity to be an asset. And at the same time, there were just heartbreaking, uh, you know, discussions about pets and decisions about pets. And in disasters, we struggle with that often because, not that we're not pet lovers as well. And in fact, service animals can be the dividing line between living in the community and not being able to. But it's it it which is why it's so important that this story is told. Um, and 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 I'm curious to know, how did you convince Apple TV Plus to do this?
Oh, well, it wasn't. Um, I don't know that they needed any convincing, but I wasn't the one. They supported this project, to an incredible extent, and you can see that with the quality of the production. I mean, there was like a 9 million liter water tank that was built to actually film a lot of the scenes with real water, to not just have to fake that, to actually put people in that, and just a fantastic crew and cast and very committed storytellers. But the real answer to that question is the executive producers, who were also the directors and the writers, the main directors and the sole writers of the series, who are, TV, very, very, experienced people in the dramatic space and television and movies. Carlton Cuse and John Ridley, and they read the book, and they wanted to make this. They wanted to do the adaptation, and so they're the ones who had the conversations with Apple. But I know that they really embraced the storytelling in it. That was that tried to honor the real events. And and a lot of these nuances, which is really unusual, I think, in TV, where you don't have a villain and a hero, but you really, really grapple with these decisions, and bringing it down to that human level, I think, can help people identify. Because when you talk about these outrageous things that you've discussed, and the numbers, the pure, like, mind-boggling numbers of people who have died, but sometimes when you bring that down to just a human being, it's so powerful, because then we can see, like, and then you multiply that in your mind by so many more people, and we grasp it, I think, on a different level.
Yeah. It's funny because as I posed that question to you, how did you get Apple TV Plus to do this? And you were like, oh, no, that's not how it went. But looking back on the question that I had asked earlier, so that's the mindset that we find ourselves in as disability.
Right. Like, you have to convince,
Right?
to tell a worthwhile story. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So so as you were sitting here and thinking, do I have to write a book? Do I have to, like, what do I need to do? What does the World Institute on Disability and our partners, what do we need to do to get people to notice these stories, right? So just in that exchange, that was a real, that was an aha moment for me.
I get it. I like that we can process that.
So talk about Emmett, please.
Yes, I will. And the actor who played him, Damon Standifer, it was just fantastic. So Emmett Everett was one of the patients in this long-term acute care unit at this hospital called Life Care, and he had had a spinal cord stroke, so that left him not able to walk, and he was also morbidly obese and had a number of health issues. So that's just a background on sort of his condition, physically. he was on the 7th floor of this hospital. He was not in the initial round of prioritization because none of the patients on that floor were. And so when the backup power failed and the elevators didn't work anymore, he was in a position of, it was going to be difficult to move down to the staging areas from which patients were then moved to the helipad or to the boat area. And it's sort of stunning when you think about it, when you step back and think about the fact that a hospital wouldn't have a way to move a patient who can't walk downstairs in
don't get me started
in an emergency, because it doesn't take a Hurricane Katrina, like a very, very notable and in some ways extreme example of a disaster in this country. But as we all know, the power fails for many reasons, and I'm sure many listeners have thought about this issue and dealt with this issue of when those, all the time when there's not good access or there aren't elevators where there should be. I'm thinking of the New York City subway. But in a hospital, come on, like where lives are in your care. So that's really struck me as I've just, as we were working on the series and just the outrageousness of that. And it suddenly struck me. And I think I called you and said, has this been fixed? Like, is this a requirement? This should be a minimal requirement. It just seems like really stunning. And there are sleds, there are different technologies that can help move a patient who is medically fragile as well, to assist them to get downstairs. But in this case, apparently they didn't have those resources or didn't know they have them. Sometimes that's the issue. If you don't require regular exercises, people forget sometimes the resources that do exist. And so there was a discussion about Mr. Everett, who was, and of course there's a whole level of bias we can talk about with cognitive disabilities. And so a lot of the patients on this floor may not have, some of them had dementia, and some of them, because of the nature of their illnesses, were kept in a sort of an unconscious state, so they weren't speaking or interacting. And Mr. Everett was an exception to that. And he was awake and alert, and because he had been at this facility for a while. The long-term nature of the care, there were strong relationships between him and the staff, who very much liked him. And he expressed the desire to be rescued, which I think is important. He wanted to be helped. He said, "Don't let them leave me behind," because his 3 roommates were moved out and he was still there. And the big issue in the discussion and the people I interviewed as I spent years researching this book, which was a work of journalism, they said we couldn't figure out how we'd get him down the stairs and up to the helipad. And according to the witnesses to this discussion and participants in this discussion, a decision was made to give him some drugs that were found in his body after his death. He was one of a number of patients, close to 24 patients, who were later found to have died with a morphine, Versed, which is a fast-acting sedative, one or the other or both of those drugs in their bodies. And his body in particular had both of those drugs that were what were considered extremely high levels. And they were not drugs that had been prescribed for him. And his case, really stood out because, all the people who were responsible for providing his care felt he was, had, from a medical standpoint, if he was moved, he was not in danger of dying. He wasn't on the brink of death where he was helped out of his last moments of life by those drugs. Like he was thought by his providers to be in a position to be rescued. And so his story is told in more depth in the series and in the book.
And he was, as I said earlier, I know so many people just like him, um, who, and there, um, for people who think of somebody like him as, you know, uh, his situation was somehow different, or that could never happen to me. That could have been any of us, and our systems are still so broken. In disaster response in Hurricane Ian, you know, we're we're learning more about an incredible woman who had been placed in a long-term care facility, and things started to fall apart at the beginning of the hurricane. And so she got her rollator and she walked out of the nursing home. She's like, I'm not staying. I'm going out into the storm. And they called the police on her. And she said, no, I'm not staying. I'm leaving. And she ended up in a shelter, and very fortunately connected with some folks who, um, folks that we work with, who wanted very much to help her to not go back to the nursing home. And so, uh, she is going to be someone who, has a much better outcome than she might otherwise have had. And you asked, Sheri, certainly things are changing. Certainly there are great examples, and so I want to call out two particular, very recent examples of great progress, and those are, both happen to be hurricanes, but Hurricane Fiona and Hurricane Ian, where in Puerto Rico, folks that we've been working with for years, who are disability community leaders, they have built an island-wide initiative of core leaders who work together before, during, and after disasters to plan for, you know, people with disabilities themselves at the forefront. And then in Florida, folks who've also had lots of practice, unfortunately, they as well have a statewide initiative, and disability community leaders have been, very actively assisting and advocating for disaster impacted people with disabilities. And of course, as we know, um, you know, the people who are most disproportionately impacted are people of color, Black and brown people, who indigenous, people who are LGBTQ, people who, have other intersecting identities that are very often marginalized, and certainly commonly people who experience poverty and people who are houseless. And the good news is these community leaders are stepping up and stepping in. We also have through our Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration, we've been doing a lot of work in support of a disability-led, women-led organization called Fight for Right in Ukraine. And so that's a very different kind of a crisis, but the issues, the needs, you know access to accessible information, evacuation, sheltering in place, extreme weather, all of those pieces are um, so similar in the, Russia's war against Ukraine. And again, another great example is the leadership of these disabled women who are really making a very big effort with a lot of support from folks around the world who want these disability-led organizations to have the resources they need to support their community. So
I think this is so important because it shows that the failures are not inevitable, and that there are successes, and there is another way, and it is doable. And so it is very important to highlight the examples that you just gave, because then we don't get mired in this, well, nothing, it can't change. And that was really true in Katrina too. There were hospitals that didn't have this happen. And I think that's really important because you can kind of focus in on this one story and wonder, well, was it inevitable? Was there another, could it have turned out differently if different choices were made? And actually we do have the counterfactual. We have places, for example, the county, the public hospital, where they were always, similar to, like you said, the resilience of people who are always having to adapt and find another way. And so this hospital was always, not enough resources and staff, and they had to adapt and improvise. And they actually had much better outcomes. They had twice as many people. They were trapped for longer, and they had fewer deaths. So, sure. and no evidence that such desperation was reached of deciding to potentially hasten patients' deaths. So those counterfactuals are really important. And the other thing I wanted to say, reflecting on the examples that you just gave, is just another where you talked about the people who are disproportionately impacted and kind of also deal with those types of maybe biases or marginalization or devaluation on a day-to-day basis, have to struggle, and how that can be magnified in a disaster. And one thing that was really interesting in COVID was this issue of prioritization, which, 5 days at Memorial, you see that really stark dilemma about which patients get rescued. But in COVID, there were also that, early on, that fear around not enough ventilators for a respiratory disease, where a lot of people will have a period of not being able to breathe on their own and need the support of a machine. And there was a fear that there wouldn't be enough ventilators, there wouldn't be enough staff to run ICUs, and this happened. There were But one of the interesting things that occurred that turned out to be a very bipartisan issue, which is rare in these days, was this idea that there had, and I know you know this very well, but listeners might be interested, just there were some written guidelines on how you would make those decisions if you being, a hospital or a hospital staff, who to prioritize if those resources were not felt to be adequate for everybody who needed them. And there were some baked-in biases that would have amplified the potential disparities, or I should say pre-existing disparities. We already know there are disparate health outcomes for some of those groups that you mentioned within healthcare on a baseline. And so there were some, very well-meaning, provisions in these guidelines that would have further disadvantaged and magnified people who needed these resources. And what was amazing, and this really shows the importance of inclusive planning, is that because small groups of people, mostly, the groups who you would imagine might populate, people who've been able to access medical school and go through that and be professionals and so these well-meaning groups of doctors and hospital administrators who had come together and ethicists, I should say, to make these plans, because there were so few examples where they had gone out to communities and made sure that all the stakeholders, i.e. all of us, any of us who could need medical resources in a disaster, that the different groups had not been part of that discussion. It was just, enclosed small rooms and not published in a lot of cases. Once that more and more people became aware of this, and disability rights groups were among the groups that kind of brought complaints to the Office of Civil Rights in the health department under both Trump and Biden, and action was taken, and those plans were changed to comply with civil rights laws in this country. So I just think that's a great example of where it just highlights the importance of having eyes on these things and having people in the room who represent viewpoints or just, I think it wouldn't have occurred to some of the planners about how these things intersect.
And, we had to do a lot of work as disability rights leaders. We were outraged. I have a friend who uses BiPAP on a daily basis, lives in the community, very successful, and they were told that they could not wear their BiPAP into the emergency room, and they would not be eligible for a ventilator. So they should just not come to the emergency room.
Wow. But that was in some of these plans. Absolutely.
Yes.
Or people who relied on ventilators at home if they got, sick. And this was, for many years, even before COVID, but if they would get sick in a pandemic, that their ventilator could be re-triaged to somebody else based on these guidelines. Yeah. Amazing. Correct. It sounds amazing to say it, but this is a very common provision in these types of guidelines.
Yeah, exactly. And, at the same time, there, because this was a public health emergency, and because there are some, specific waivers, flexibilities, there were some really unfortunate, and I would argue illegal, efforts to, move people out of acute care hospital beds, people with COVID, for instance, and move them into long-term care facilities while they had COVID in order to make space for other folks who were sicker. And then those folks brought COVID into the long-term care facilities, or it, more recently, and of course, COVID is nowhere near over, but more recently, people have been, people who don't have COVID have been moved into facilities where lots of people are sick, and so that's made them sick. It's there's so much that we all need to find opportunities to learn from. People talk a lot about lessons learned, and we sort of joke, lessons observed, necessarily learned. And we also, there's a lot of talk about, building back better, and we think we should actually be building forward better. Building back has not served us very well. So, I think if we take the good and promising practices. And, we all take the opportunity to imagine and then do the work to have, to prioritize better outcomes. I think this is a real turning point for us as a nation, globally, the work that we're doing in other countries. Many countries, as you said earlier, are doing far better than we are here in the US, which is incredibly disturbing to people and uncomfortable. And so much more work to be done. And, I think this conversation has been such a gift. The World Institute on Disability, we have a, What's Up WID podcast, and we bring a lot of really great folks to the mic, and having you be a part of our podcasts, it means so much to me, Sheri, and your work, your continued work. I can't wait to hear and see what you do on COVID. I welcome every opportunity to chew through some of the thorny issues if you want to talk about them. And just so appreciative of your leadership and your willingness to sort of take a dive into some of these issues from a disability perspective. So.
Well, thank you, Marcie, and I would say just please keep telling the stories, and if there are, well, in particular with COVID now, with the book, if you or the listeners have examples that are important to get out, I would love to hear from you. So keep me in your Rolodex.
Okay. That's a promise.
Yeah, and thank you. It was a really I learned a lot from our conversation, as I always do when we speak.
Yeah, so. Me too. Any last thoughts or anything you want to sort of put out there?
I just to thank you, and thanks to your community for continuing to to your colleagues, to people in the disability rights community for I guess educating and raising awareness among all of us, including journalists who might not have known some of the things that you bring to light. So yeah, thank you for that. And like you said, we can end on that positive note of knowing that there's more work to do, and it can be done, and that change can happen. And even if it impacts, one community at a time, it's still really, really valid, or one individual at a time, like the person you just talked about.
Yeah. And in closing, I would like to say, let's dedicate this discussion to Emmett and to someone who was very pivotal for me, Benilda Cachetta, who also survived Katrina. So how about if we dedicate this discussion to them?
And that's beautiful.